Hey everyone, welcome to WittCode. In this video, we're going to learn how to connect a custom React app to an Nginx reverse proxy for a Node server with Docker Compose. We will create the React app from scratch using Webpack and Express. So here's a demonstration of what we're going to build. This is a React app right here, as seen by our app component. And what it does is it just makes an API call to our Nginx reverse proxy, which essentially goes through Nginx, which then proxies it to our Express server, which then provides this list of cheeses. So say we remove all of these except for one, and we look back over here, remake this request. We only have one request from our Express server. Let's put these back, make a request again, and they're all back here. We have live updates. So say we want to add one right here, like say Wit Scepter, which is the name of my Chrome extension, if you're curious, and it lists it all down here. But if we look at our API recall right here, and in our headers, we can see right here, we're on localhost 5678, which is where Express is serving up our React application. And then, but we're making a call to 5679, which is where Nginx is listening, which then proxies the request to Express. Of course, because we're working with different origins, we're going to learn about working with cores and things like that in this video. So for example, this kind of here is what the layout of this project. Note that this is for development, as in production, you would most likely have Nginx be serving up your React app or your static content. But for this, we have our Node server, which the client will make a request, which will return our React app. Our React app will then, any API call it makes is sent up to Nginx, which then proxies it to Node, which then gives the response back to Nginx and back to the React application. So in development, we are getting our static content or our React app from our Node server. But in a production environment, just note that you would most likely have your React app being served up from Nginx. But so this is what we're going to be building in this video. But so to begin, I'm going to shut this down, and then we are just going to have an empty directory like this. And the first thing we're going to do is define the location of our Express server and also Nginx reverse proxy using environment variables. So I'm going to get all these from my blog site and just post them in right here. So this is essentially the location of our Nginx reverse proxy, and this is the location of our Node server. We need to specify localhost right here in this URL for both the server and proxy, as these requests will originate from the React application, which is outside the Docker network. So these right here, the host can be called reverse proxy C, server C, because these will be in the Docker network. So Docker will perform its own form of DNS, whereas when we're making requests in the browser, we need to use localhost. But now we've got this out of the way, let's initialize our project. So we're going to do this with npm init es6-y, and actually we're going to do this inside a server directory for our server code, and we're going to have another called reverse proxy, which will hold our Nginx configuration. But we're going to go into our server, and now we'll run npm init es6-y, and now we're going to install Webpack and Webpack CLI. So npmi Webpack CLI as development dependencies. And so these packages will allow us to turn our React code into JavaScript that the browser understands. So basically JSX, React code to just basic JavaScript. But for it to do this, we need to install something called a loader, and specifically a Babel loader. So these are Babel loader, Babel preset env, and preset React. And so a Webpack loader is simply a function that Webpack uses to convert code from one form to another. Webpack will use the Babel loader to convert JSX code to code that the browser understands. Now we need to install a plugin for Webpack called the HTML Webpack plugin. It's just right here, HTML Webpack plugin. And so a plugin allows us to plug into Webpack's lifecycle. And the HTML Webpack plugin will allow us to apply our bundled React code to an HTML file. And then finally, we just need to install NodeMon as a development dependency so we can get live code updates, so we can reload our Express server whenever there are changes. And now let's just change the entry point in our package.json file to be our server file, which we will just create right now, called server.js. This will of course be where we write our Express code. And then we just need to create a script to start this, which will use NodeMon, and then run our entry point, which is signified by this dot right here. And now that we've done that, let's configure Webpack to use the loaders and plugins that we just created. So in our server folder, the Webpack config mode.cjs. And I'm just going to paste all this in and then go over what it does. So initially we have mode set to development, which will make Webpack set things such as node environment variable to development and also turn on and off certain plugins. We set our entry point to be index.jsx, which is where Webpack will start bundling our React code and transforming it to regular JavaScript. We set our target to web, as we are going to be working in a web environment, as we are working with a React application in the browser. Then we have our output, which will essentially make a file called bundle.js inside a folder called dist, containing all our bundled up React code. And note that it's important that we specify public path here to this route, as this is where Express will be serving our bundle from. We'll see more on this in a second, but this public path essentially tells Webpack where to output its bundled files to. Then we have our plugins right here, which is essentially telling Webpack to place our bundled JavaScript code inside our HTML file. And then we also use this right here, which will inject all of these environment variables into our React app. So it'll use the values in here and inject all of these into our React application. And then finally, we have our rules right here, which tell Webpack how to handle a certain module. And here we are saying that for any file ending in .js or JSX, except for those in the node modules, run them through the Babel loader to convert them into lower level JavaScript that the browser understands. But now let's create our React app. And so to do that, we just need to install React and React DOM. So of course, React is the core library for React, and React DOM renders the React app in the DOM. And now let's fill in our index.html file. So inside our server directory, we're going to create a client folder, which will be our React app. And actually, I forgot to create a source directory. So we're going to move our server code into source and our client into source as well. And now within here, we'll create an index.html file. I'm just going to paste this in. And the most important part of this file is this div with the ID root. This is where the React DOM package will use to create our React app, or where it will place our React app. And now let's just create the glue between our DOM and the React app. It's going to be a file called index.jsx. And in here, just going to paste in some code. And so essentially, this code renders our React application into the div element that we gave the ID root. Now let's create a components directory, which is where we will have our app component. And this app component is essentially just going to be all our JavaScript or all our React code, because we're not going to have much code in here. So first, we're just going to create a component called app and set some state. We have an abort controller, which we can use to cancel this fetch request right here if the component unmounts, because you don't want to set state on an unmounted component, because this can lead to memory leaks. Then we just make an API call to Nginx using the Nginx environment variable to API-cheeses, which is of course an API on our Express server. And then we're going to loop through the return cheeses data and just print out the name and the description. But so that's it for our Express app. So now let's start working on for our React app. Now let's start creating our Express server. The first thing we're going to do is just install Express. And remember, this Express app is what we're going to use to serve up our React app. And now let's import Express, create our cheeses API, and also just get our Express server listening on a port. So I'm just going to paste this in. These are from our environment variables. We're going to add some nice logging so we can see the current request method URL. This is our cheeses API that our app component here is requesting, which will come through Nginx and then come to the server. And then we're just listening on the provided port and host. But now remember how we're serving our React app from this server. And to do this, we need to get Webpack and Express to work together. And we can do this with the npm package Webpack dev middleware. Install that as a development dependency. And so this package emits files processed by Webpack to a server. So we're going to use it to emit our bundled React application to our Express server, which we can then serve to the client. So first, what we're going to do to get this working is we are going to import at the top of our file Webpack, this dev middleware, and also our Webpack configuration. And we're going to do this because we want to bind our Webpack dev middleware as application level middleware, as we want it to be called each time a request is sent to the server. So after our logging, we're going to create a compiler. So when we import the Webpack library directly like this, we get a function that when called returns a compiler, and it accepts a Webpack configuration, which is simply the one we have in our configuration file. We then pass the Webpack compiler and a configurations object to our Webpack dev middleware. A required property is this public path, as this is where the Webpack dev middleware will serve our bundle from. And this is why we need to match it to what's in our Webpack configuration here, because this is where Webpack will output its bundle, and then we're telling the dev middleware on Express over here to serve it up from that location. But so we're almost done with Express. The final thing we need to do now is just add some hot module replacement. And this is so we can get our application to reload with changes. So hot module replacement, or HMR, detects module changes in an actively running application. And this makes the development process more efficient, as it only updates what has changed and instantly updates the browser with these modifications. And we can enable hot module reloading by using a middleware called Webpack Hot Middleware, which we can install as a development dependency. Now we just need to import this package at the top of our Express file. So import it up here. And then we just need to add this middleware once again to our Express app, which we will do after our Webpack dev middleware. And so specifically, this Webpack hot middleware, it returns a function that accepts a Webpack compiler and a configuration object as a second argument. However, we also need to make some changes to our Webpack configuration now. So back in our Webpack configuration, we need to add a plugin called the Webpack Hot Module Replacement plugin. And so this plugin right here enables Webpack to perform HMR. And then the final thing we need to do is just change our entry point so that it works with both our Express server and Webpack Hot Middleware. So this is what we put right here. And essentially, this code configures our Express server to receive a notification when Webpack builds the client bundle. In other words, when our React application is rebuilt, our Express server will be notified of this, causing it to serve up this new bundle. This reload true right here is a configuration option that auto reloads the browser page when Webpack gets stuck. But now we're done with our Express server and configuration. So let's create a Docker image now out of our stuff. So the top level of our server directory, we'll create a Docker file, and it's not going to be very complicated. We're just going to have a base image of node version 20. We're going to set our working directory to be a server. Inside the container, we're going to copy over our package.json and package lock to the server directory, install the dependencies, and then run npm start. Note how we're not actually copying over any code, and this is because we're going to do this later with Docker Compose using volumes. And so that's all we need to do to create a Docker image with Node. Now let's configure Nginx to be a reverse proxy. And so before we do this, actually, let's talk about what it means for Nginx to be a reverse proxy. So when Nginx proxies a request, it will send the request to the specified server, retrieve the response, and then send it back to the client. And we can easily configure Nginx to do this by using the proxy pass directive. So I'm going to create a file here called default.conf.template and just paste in this code right here. And so what we're essentially doing is we're modifying certain headers by using this proxy set header directive. One of the headers we're modifying is the host header, and this host header specifies the host and port number of the server the request is being sent to. This $host variable right here is an Nginx variable that will be the host name from the request line. We also add this xRealIP right here, which specifies the IP address of the client. And we can do that by using the remote address variable, which is the client address. But the most important part is this proxy pass directive. And this tells Nginx where to forward the request. And we're telling it to send the request to our node server, specifically to the API route. So when we receive a request to Nginx on the location-API, we will set these headers, and then we will proxy it to our Express server. Express will respond, and then Nginx will forward it back to the client. And of course, we're just listening on the provided Nginx port and host. But before we go any further, we need to talk about Nginx and cores, because if we bring up this diagram again, we are serving our React application from Express, but sending requests to Nginx. And so because we're doing this, we will come across some cores issues. And so cross-origin resource sharing, or cores, is a mechanism enforced by the browser that uses origins to determine if a website at one origin can request data from a website at a different origin. And so for us, in this application, Express will be listening on this origin here, whereas Nginx will be listening on this origin here. So these are different origins because the port numbers right here are different. So if we serve up Express or serve up our React app here from this Express server and then make a request to this origin, cores will block this request. But so how does CORS actually determine if a cross-origin request is allowed? And the answer is HTTP headers. So CORS is an HTTP header-based mechanism, meaning it is implemented through the use of HTTP headers. Two important headers for CORS are access control allow origin and also just origin. So these two headers. So origin right here is a request header that indicates the origin that caused the request, and access control allow origin is a response header that indicates whether the response can be shared with the origin requesting the data. So essentially, we just need to add these headers to our Express or to our Nginx. You can do this on Express or Nginx. I like to add these headers on Nginx. And we're going to add them right above here. So we're going to add access control allow origin, and we're going to set this to server URL. Because remember, as our Express server is going to be serving up our React app, the origin header will be this right here. Will be localhost, and I'll show you this in the demonstration too, but we have 5678. This will be the Express server URL. So in our access control allow origin, we need to also set this here. So this header, access control allow origin, indicates whether the response can be shared with the original or the origin requesting the data. This allow credentials right here tells the browser whether the server allows cross-origin requests to include credentials such as cookies. So if you're using the fetch API, for example, and you want the HTTP cookies to be sent along with it, you will need to also add this header. And then we also have some other over here, which I'm not going to get in depth into in this video, but they're essentially for pre-flight requests. But so that, this will also make more sense when I go over the demonstration. But now let's just create our Docker image, so our Nginx Docker image, which we're going to do with our Docker file. All I'm going to put in here is just the base image of Nginx version 1.25. We're going to copy over our configuration and everything else using volumes. And so let's actually get started with volumes right now. We're going to do that using a docker compose.yaml file. And to start off, we're going to create a server for our node modules. And so we need a volume for our node modules, as the node modules folder can be problematic for Docker if it contains packages with binaries that are specific to certain operating systems. In other words, certain packages will install different files depending on the operating system of the computer. And this can cause issues if you are developing an application with Docker, as the Docker container doesn't always use the same operating system as the host computer. So for example, I'm using Mac OS, but in the Docker container, we're going to be using Alpine, a version of Linux. So if we install certain packages on this Mac machine, and then we import them all into this Alpine Linux Docker container, some of those packages might not work. So this volume right here is going to prevent the node modules inside our Docker container from being overwritten. And I also have a video that goes in depth into that if you want to look for it. Just type in WittCode Docker node modules in YouTube. But next, let's create our node service. And so essentially, we're just going to create a node service here. We're going to call the image server version 1. We're going to name the container. We're going to build it from our Docker file, import all our environment variables, restart it whenever the container stops, map our host computer port to the one in the container, and then we're going to copy over all our server code here, but prevent the node modules from being overwritten by using this volume. And then I have depends on reverse proxy here, but actually we're going to have our reverse proxy depend on our server because it can't forward requests to our server if the server service isn't up and running. So we'll specify that now by creating our Nginx reverse proxy service. So just going to paste this in like this. I'm going to add a depends on our server. But essentially, we're creating an image called reverse proxy version 1. We're setting the name of the container. We're building it using our Docker file. We're injecting all our environment variables, restarting it whenever it crashes, and mapping our ports. And this right here is where we are bringing in our Nginx configuration. And it's important to map it to this location in Nginx, as if we provide a template file in here, then the Nginx Docker image will essentially replace any environment variables in this template file and then load them into Nginx's main configuration, which is why we can use environment variables in this file, which is what these are here. And I've also have a video that goes in depth in that. Just type in WittCode environment variables Nginx and you should find it. And then once again, we depend on our server. So we want our server to be up before Nginx can forward requests to it. But this is essentially all we need to do. So now we just need to run this application, which you can do with Docker Compose env file.env and up. And so specifying this env file flag right here will load all our environment variables into this docker compose.yaml file. Just run up. Oh, and the reason we get this is because we need to go to the top level of our directory. And now if we run this, and it looks like because I created these earlier, let me remove these images. So back in the project from earlier, I'm just going to run docker compose down so that these are removed. And now I'm going to remove those images so we can start from fresh. So the other one is called server version 1.0.0. And now if we run this command, hopefully everything starts to work. Sweet. So we're building our images. We're going through our Dockerfile steps. So now we're installing all our packages. Let me bring this over so we can see when it loads. All right, and so now it looks like everything has loaded. So we can see our server is listening, and we can also see some Webpack information and some Nginx information. So now let's open up, which I believe it's the same page here. And if we look at our console, we can see our Express server logs with the request, and we can also see our our Nginx logs. So we can see a get request -API-cheeses, and then we can see how it reaches our Express application. And if we look inside here, let me show you these CORS headers. So here are our response headers, which we set. So we have access control allow origin right here, which we all set in our configuration right here. And then if we look at the request headers, we can see origin is 5678 because the request is coming from this origin. So that's why we need to specify in our response that we allow origin 5678 because we are making this request to localhost 5679. So hopefully that cleared up some of the CORS issues, but let me also just double check our live reloading and everything is working. So if we go to our app, let's add a h1 saying download WittScepter, my Chrome extension, if you would be ever so kind doing that. And we could see our live reloads, and let's then double check our API is working by let's just paste like this like a few more times, see if we get some scrolling, and we do. We get a lot of scrolling. Sweet. But so this is my video on connecting a React app to an Nginx reverse proxy for a node server. If you have any questions, leave them for me in the comments, and I'll try and get back to you. But besides that, thanks for liking and subscribing, and I hope to see you next one. Have a good one.